Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. It's great to see you here. Please come sit forward. There's plenty of room in the front of you. I'll just mention one logistical thing is that we are filming this for posterity, so we'll never be forgotten on YouTube. But if you can just avoid it, just to sort of move chairs into the middle. I mean, everyone's fine right now, but just when people get excited, sometimes the arguments begin. So my name is Laurent Dubois. I'm an academic director here at the Karsh Institute of Democracy, and we're really glad to welcome you here today. Melody Barnes, the executive director, is here. Hello. Also, and I just want to thank our whole team here who do a lot of work to set all this up. We hope you'll come back to other events. We have 3 Touchstones of Democracy events this fall. We've already had one on the Civil War. And on November 30th, we hope you'll come back for a conversation with Philippe Rogers about a new book called The Darkened Light of Faith, which is about African-American thought and democracy in the United States. I'm really delighted to welcome Andrew Curran here to UVA. Invited me years ago to Wesleyan and was a wonderful host, so we're doing our best to return that. Andrew is the William Armstrong Professor of the Humanities at Wesleyan University and one of the most influential scholars working on the French Enlightenment today. He's the author of an incredible book called The Anatomy of Blackness, Science and Slavery in the Era of Enlightenment, a rich and innovative exploration of the complexities of racial thinking in the 18th century. He recently edited with Henry Louis Gates, Jr., a book called Who's Black and Why, a hidden chapter in the 18th century invention of race. And the foundations of his work, though, all lie in his intensive study and knowledge of what we'll be talking about today. His first book, Sublime Disorder, was a deep study of Diderot's thinking on the question of the human body and monstrosity. And the book we'll be discussing today, The Art of Thinking Freely. He offers a riveting and lively history of Diderot's personal life and the way it shaped his radical thinking. We have copies of the book outside, so please pick one up. Andrew will sign afterwards if you'd like. We are really lucky to have here also a kind of reunion of sorts. There's a long-standing link between Andrew and Philippe Roger, who met years ago at New York University, and I'm told Philippe told him to work on Diderot, and he's followed his advice. Absolutely. So he's finished his homework for the class and is ready to present. Ready for the
20 years later, it's worse than Monte Cristo.
Exactly. Roger is a distinguished scholar of the French 18th century literature and culture. He's taught all over the world, in the United States and Latin America, has a position at the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique at the Sorbonne and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, so the two primary research institutes in Paris. He's taught at NYU, as we've heard, as well as Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford before about 20 years ago, about settling on the best of the institutions, which is the University of Virginia, and has been with us teaching for the fall and various semesters since then. His scholarship ranges widely with writings on the Marquis de Sade, the Encyclopédie, a book on French anti-Americanism, which is translated into many languages called The American Enemy in English. And we are delighted that Roger will be leading the conversation today with Andrew about Diderot and the importance of his thought for understanding democracy. So they're going to be in dialogue for about 35 minutes, exploring the work and Diderot's legacy. Then we'll open it up to you all for questions and conversation. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much, Laurent, and everybody for coming. Let's go directly to a topic. It's of course quite a wonderful, occasion for me because I've not seen Andrew for a very long time. He tells me I was the one to suggest that maybe Diderot, and indeed at the time, although I've been working mostly on the Marquis de Sade, Diderot was already, and still is, I think, my favorite 18th century French writer. So I really happy we have this conversation. Maybe we can start with the fact that Diderot was not always as big in the landscape, the intellectual, scholarly landscape, as he has become. And we could even speak, maybe, I don't know if you would agree with that, Andrew, but there was a long purgatory for Diderot. I mean, his contemporaries didn't take him very seriously, thought he had not done a book that would remain. He was himself very worried about his posterity. The 19th century ignored him completely. And suddenly in the 20th century, I would even say second half of the 20th century, has become like one of the greatest, and in my eyes, the greatest. So maybe we could start from that. And what do you think of this? What I see as more than a rehabilitation, like it's a new birth of Diderot and his reputation and his readership too.
Thank you so much, and also thank you so much, Laurent, for having me here. It's a delightful opportunity to talk about Diderot. Very much like Philippe, who, when I walked into his office and said, "I'm thinking about working on Petit de la Bretonne," he said, "No, that's not going to be good. Work on Diderot. It's so much more interesting. And I can't thank you enough. Really changed my life, because Diderot is the kind of person who sits on your shoulder and talks to you throughout your entire life. I mean, the maxims just flow, the aphorisms flow, and it's really interesting to think about somebody who is such a dynamic thinker. And it's true that right now, Diderot has come into his own, I think, for a lot of reasons. He worried tremendously about posterity, and maybe I'll talk about kind of why that happened. Laurent brought up posterity a second ago, which is why I said that's a great thing to bring up at this point. Diderot said that posterity is for the philosopher what heaven is for the man of religion. In other words, for somebody who doesn't believe in God, all we have is posterity, leaving a legacy for people here. And I think he'd be delighted that we're talking about him today. I think a lot of people may not know who he is, and I'm going to kind of maybe talk about him a little bit before I get to the question about why he has become so interesting to us. Robert Darnton, who is a famous 18th century scholar, says, who's your favorite philosopher, Voltaire or Rousseau? And the answer is Diderot. So that's kind of where I'd like to start. So Diderot lived 70 years. And I'm not going to walk you through every kind of thing that happened to his whole life, but imagine he was born in 1713 in a very, very small walled city in close to Burgundy, let's just say, called Langres, 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 which is an old city, a Roman city, fortified city. And he grew up, he was the son of a cutlery maker, and his mother came from a family of tanners. So this is a kind of a bourgeois family, or petit bourgeois workers. This is a kind of a working class family, we could say at this point in the United States, and a very religious family. His whole family had a lot of priests in his family, and he too was thinking about becoming a priest. He was tonsured at age 13. He went to a Jesuit school because his family had enough money for him to learn Latin and French, so he had the opportunity to go to the school. And he then went off to Paris at age 15 or so, didn't see his family for a long time at that point, and started going to the Collège d'Harcourt, which is on the not too far from Notre Dame and the Sorbonne at this point. So he goes there for a couple of years, and then he goes to the Sorbonne, which is the Faculty of Theology. The Sorbonne we think about as a university, a research university like University of Virginia, where you're pushing back the frontiers of knowledge. Not at all. What happens at the Sorbonne is that you replicate knowledge. It's a vocational school for lawyers, doctors, and theologians, etc. So you really are not kind of creating knowledge, you're replicating yourself there. After a few years, he says, I'm done with this. And now we're in 1735. He's 22 years old. At this point, he goes through a great dilettante stage. I had my own dilettante stage too in Paris before I met Philippe. And so he is doing all sorts of stuff. He's a translator. He learns, teaches himself English, teaches himself Italian, and then becomes a translator of English and Shaftesbury's essay on merit and virtue. At this point, he has fallen into a group of kind of free thinkers. So we're getting closer to free thinking, democracy, these kind of ideas as well. And now we're in the 1740s. And he gets into real trouble because he writes a book called the Philosophical Thoughts. Then he writes another book called The Letter on the Blind. Philosophical Thoughts is interesting for us because it has one of his major maxims, which is skepticism is the first step toward truth. If he had a tattoo, he would have had that on his back, I think. Skepticism is the first step toward truth. And I think it's a really interesting thing for us all to keep in mind in an era of incredible dogmatism, that you need to think about you need to think about everything from a lot of different angles before you draw a conclusion. That's both on the left and the right. And so it's very interesting to think about this this kind of idea being put forward. Of course, before 1750, the main consideration wasn't politics, it was religion at this point. Religion and kind of a theological view of life was incredibly important. So the skepticism was not just about life in general, it was really about received ideas, spiritual causality, miracles, and all these things will show up later on. I'll try to go a little faster now. In 1749, he writes this book, The Letter on the Blind, in which he conjures up a blind man who refutes the existence of God. He creates this amazing, dynamic, Lucretian world of chaos, primordial soup with no God. It's a godless world, and he gets thrown into jail in 1749 in October. The book probably would not have gotten him in trouble, but he did it. He published it at the wrong time. There's a lot of other hot things happening at the time, so he's thrown into jail. And they want to make an example of him. At this point, he's 35 years old, and I call this the big caesura in his life. 35 years, 1749, and then he lives for another 35 years. And I think it's interesting to break up his life like that because he's trying to be a public intellectual at this point, and afterwards he can't do it. He's in jail for 103 days or something like that, which is in a very cold prison in the Chateau de Vincennes. It's not fun at all. And he's told that if you ever do anything like this again, you're gonna go in forever. And this is in the back of his mind. Now, what saves him is the fact that he had already signed on to create the Great Encyclopedia. And this is what he's known for primarily. The Encyclopedia is one of the most important books of the 18th century, if not the most important book of the 18th century, because it really was designed to change the way that people think. Talk about a touchstone of democracy. There are a lot of really interesting subversive ideas that went against what was going on in Ancien Régime France, which was deeply, Ancien Régime France was a deeply conservative country from our perspective at this point. At any rate, he is going to write 7,000 articles for the encyclopedia, which is, I always point out to my undergrads who have a hard time writing papers, try 7,000. He's allowed to plagiarize a lot more than most people do. And the encyclopedia itself is 17 volumes of text, 11 volumes of beautiful, beautiful plates, and it really had an enormous impact. There's a lot of fake copies that circulate, and it's something that people read at the dinner table, just kind of talk about, what does he think about political authority, for example? And they show it right there. But Diderot had to hide. He couldn't do a lot of things that other writers were doing. Voltaire was far away and very careful. He could scoot into Switzerland if he wanted. Diderot was right in Paris and didn't move. Rousseau was also kind of moving around. He would get in trouble as well. But Diderot was right there, and he was always possibly going to be thrown into jail. The encyclopedia gets shut down twice, 1752, 1759. And he's really worried that he's going to end up back in jail. What he will do is to sublimate, I think. He will publish for posterity. He talks about posterity all the time. And so he produced 3 sets of manuscripts that he wanted to explode like bombs after he and that's why posterity is so important for him. The second half of the book I call Late Harvest, because I love late harvest wine. And he did produce this great late harvest of the Enlightenment. And he touches on so many different things. And of course, it's the 19th century, to get back to the question, finally, it's the 19th century that we'll start discovering a lot of these things. They trickle out over time. And he becomes enormously important for people like Marx, for Freud, for Balzac, in many different areas. Stanislavski in terms of theater, he becomes super important for lots of different people for lots of different reasons. But you're right, and during the revolution, he was persona non grata because he was an atheist. And the French Revolution, which inherited many of the ideas that he had put forward, did not want to canonize an atheist because that was not good politics. So who goes into the pantheon? Voltaire and Rousseau. not Diderot. So that's kind of a long introduction, but just to give you an idea of who he is.
Well, it's quite necessary to reconstruct this, and I think that's an interesting point. Is you're raising is also what I would call the vulnerability of Diderot. By that I mean that compared to Montesquieu, well, his name, his castle, his title, his status as a magistrate, compared to Voltaire, who was rich, who was very well connected, and was wise enough to have a house on the Swiss border. Diderot was very vulnerable. I mean, he came from a small town. You described Langres perfectly. Nobody wants to come from Langres. I mean, I wouldn't. And he was in bad terms with his family. I mean, for reasons you alluded to, because they were religious, and he was like a black sheep in the family. He was not rich, and that's a major reason why he had to spend his life making money, just to make a living and provide for his wife and daughter. So how, and I'm interested also by the prison, the jail moments, which is probably a terrible shock. And I think you're right to point out that there is a Caesar at this moment. How much do you think that the prison experience was like one of the major motives that he kept so many manuscripts in the drawer?
Yes.
It's a controversial, I mean, there's a debate about that.
There is a debate. Why did he do this? I mean, there was a time in the 1770s, certainly, where he was thinking about publishing his complete works. When he was in Holland, he was talking to the editors, etc., but it just never kind of came to fruition. And he was very unhappy with a pirated edition that came out at that time. But I do think that really prison changed him dramatically. And when he gets out, he can't operate. He doesn't have the same support that others had. Voltaire was in the Académie Française, for example. He was rejected for the Académie Française. He didn't have a great patron until in the 1770s, when Catherine the Great of Russia actually saves the day for him. But for a long time, he is just getting by. He lived in a bunch of flea pit apartments. Early on in his career, some terrible, terrible apartments. His wife, the woman he married, Antoinette Champion, was not up to his parents' standards. That's why he was initially kind of rejected by his family. There were other reasons after that as well. And so he was really, it was a kind of a hard scrabble life for a long time. And finally, he thinks he's going to have enough money from the encyclopedia. He's not well paid for the encyclopedia, and he's just kind of running. Finally, by the 1750s, there's a kind of, I call it the eye of the storm, where he's starting to make enough money. He has a decent apartment in the, really what is the Boulevard Saint-Germain right now. You can actually see the Rue Tarenne, where he lived, just the last little bits of this road that was knocked down by Haussmann. Anyway, so he really had a tough time for a long time. He had done the 6th floor, and then when his heart started failing, he was going to climb up the stairs all the way to the 6th floor. Finally, he does receive an enormous gift from Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great was a great fan. She was a great fan of Voltaire as well, and a great fan of D'Alembert, Diderot's co-editor of the encyclopedia. And she, when they realized that he had fallen upon hard times, one of Diderot's friends was kind of just telling the great monarchs of Europe that somebody needed to help out Diderot, and maybe they could buy his library. He had a 3,000 volume library. Catherine the Great said, sure, I'll buy it under 2 conditions. 1, that Diderot gets to keep his library, and 2, that I will hire him to take care of it. So he gets to keep all the books and get paid. They missed a year of payment, and he gently said to her ambassador that he had not been paid. And Catherine the Great wrote back and said, well, listen, it can't happen. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so she gave him the equivalent of $700,000 all at once, in order to have him be the curator of his library until age 102. So at that point, he had made it. But for a long time, Philippe, it was really true. It was a tough existence.
Before we get to despots and Catherine and the question of despotism, I just want to spend 1 second in going towards the democracy theme. About the encyclopedia, let's stick with the encyclopedia for a second. The name of Diderot is attached, for better or worse, to the encyclopedia. If I say worse, it's just because it's somehow threw a shadow on the rest of his oeuvre for a very long time. I'm going to quote you. Yes.
Wow.
Of course, you know, it's always your style when you quote someone, of course. You write in your book, page 336, that Diderot's contributions to the encyclopedia reflect, I'm quoting, a moderate humanism. So I was a bit startled by the formula because, well, first, don't you think it's a bit unfair because you are opposing that to a more radical stand on many issues, and I think with a touch of reproach in the formula. Maybe I'm wrong. And so do you think the encyclopedia in itself had such constraints that, don't you think that the moderation was something he couldn't help? And my second question in the question would be, after the first caesura, it seems that your book makes another very interesting point, introducing another caesura in Diderot's intellectual journey, which would be like 1770, if I read you well. That is a moment of radicalization. So, you know, it's like a double question on, aren't you a bit harsh on Diderot at this point on the encyclopedia? And am I right in reading in your book the idea that he changes politically in around 1770?
Yes and yes. So, I mean, I certainly, I think in the overall development, which I can't remember, of talking about moderate humanism, I think that maybe that's in comparison to some of his other ideas elsewhere in his unpublished texts. Within the encyclopedia, it's absolutely true. The constraints are enormous. You have to imagine that there's several layers of censorship at the time. The Sorbonne is censoring, the Parliament is censoring, and the censor is censoring. So he may have had a royal permission to publish this, but in fact, he was just always waiting for things that the other for somebody to come down on him very harshly. So there's a time, and particularly as the encyclopedia moves on, he's kind of pulling back from the whole thing. He wrote, I think, 3,000 articles for the first 3 volumes. And then he's delegating more and more articles to Jaucourt, who is the great kind of workhorse of the encyclopedia, who wrote 17,000 articles. It's out of 74,000 articles. 17 for Jaucourt, 7 for Diderot, and there's a number of people who are writing thousands of articles too. So I do think there's a softening in many ways. He was also disgusted by the fact that some of his more radical ideas were censored, and you have them here at UVA. You have the 18th volume of the encyclopedia, which has the censored articles, which are really interesting. Like Sarrazin, I think, is one of them. There are a number of articles that allow us to see that not only did Diderot self-censor, but his own editor censored him, for sure. So he was very disappointed in the way the encyclopedia was going on, which is one of the reasons he was thinking that maybe he would do a second encyclopedia. It was really not well at this time. It didn't make too much sense, but he would get a whole bunch of money from Catherine the Great and created a fabulous free encyclopedia with free ideas. It would actually drop like bombs on France, he said, or Voltaire may have said that. I think after a while, Catherine the Great said, maybe that's not a great idea. So she kind of like pulled back from that idea. But certainly in the 1770s, he's getting increasingly, I put this like either unhappy or no longer enchanted with these great enlightened despots. For the longest time, there was this idea in the 18th century that we're hoping that there'll be a philosopher king who will come and actually kind of change the world with all the power of a king, but with all the kind of enlightened perspective of a philosopher. And he thought about this, Voltaire thought about this, the two great kind of enlightened, quote unquote, enlightened despots of the era, Frederick II of Prussia and Catherine the Great.
Is again postponing our approach of despotism and your chapter 12, which is very interesting, the call to insurgents and the despots at the same time. Maybe I'd like to introduce just one question about, don't you think that one of the reasons why for a long time Diderot was not considered as a political thinker? And it's quite interesting that we organize today a dialogue, a conversation about Diderot as a political thinker, because that idea wasn't obvious for a very long time, in fact, for almost 2 centuries. And one of the reasons might be, I don't know if you would agree, that he decided at some point to embed most of his political thinking in his fictional work. And I'm speaking, I like to give an example, that is Jacques le Fataliste. Jacques the Fatalist, I think, in English, the same title. There is this stupendous scene in the middle of the book. It's about a master and a servant. And there is this, and you know also most probably that this text, which was not taken into consideration by many people, one of the reasons being that it had been published very in the very limited diffusion of the correspondance littéraire. So it was like almost unknown text for a long time. Nevertheless, the Germans were extremely excited by the text, just like they were extremely excited by Rameau's Nephew. And we know for sure that this text has been one of the source for Hegel and his dialectic of master and slave, which is not a small thing. And there is a stupendous scene in the middle of Jacques le Fataliste, where they travel together. They are a master and a servant, and they travel and travel and travel. And at some point, they have a quarrel. The quarrel in an inn, and the quarrel starts because the master says he calls him. He doesn't even call Jacques un Jacques, but he mentions the phrase un Jacques, a Jacques. That is, he puts the indefinite article before the name Jacques, and that's like a trait of genius on behalf of Diderot. And Jacques immediately answers, "A Jacques, sir, is a man like any other." And the master says, "No, a Jacques, I'm translating, a Jacques is not a man like another." So it all starts with that question of the subaltern not being a person. And this passage is so, I can't comment on it because it would be too long, but in those 3 pages of the quarrel between the master and Jacques, you have the position of domination. You have an analysis of what it means to be subaltern. As you know, servants had no social existence. And the master is right, they don't even have a name. Most masters would call servants by the name of the province they were from. We find that also in Marivaux's theater in Beaumarchais. And then there is the innkeeper with a woman who comes and say, "Oh, stop quarreling, no, it's too bad. Do you want me to be the judge?" And there is a parody of the judicial solution to a social problem, because she's a very clever, very smart woman, and she says, "Okay, the master wants Jacques to get out of the room and descend, go down," which is very symbolical, and he doesn't want. So the innkeeper says, "Okay, this is what we'll do. Jacques is going to go down and then he will come back up and everything will be like before. That is, I will reestablish the de facto equality between the two of us. And they say, yes, because in fact, they don't want to be, they don't want to be crossed, they like each other. So it's a total parody. And she adds, and I forbid that there be any discussion of the reasons for this state of affairs, which is a nice parody of the judicial treatment of social inequality. And that's not even the end. I finished there because Jacques, after that, they reconcile, they drink a bottle, and Jacques tells his master, well, now let's be serious. Let's draw a contract, which is a scathing satire of the idea of social contract. Because the master says, but what kind of contract? And Jacques says, oh, it's very easy. We will decide that since I have the thing and you have nothing but the title, I will be the master and you will obey me. And the master said, but it's impossible. I mean, nowhere, never was there such a contract. And Jacques said, oh, yes. All social contracts are exactly that. So it's one of the most, I think, I don't know what you think about it, but I think it's one of the boldest political statements ever made before the French Revolution.
I agree. And I think that's in French, it's wonderful. He says like, tu as le titre, mais t'as pas la chose, or something like that, the title and the thing. And it's such an interesting thing that is one of those ideas that comes back to me quite a bit when you find somebody who has a lot of power, but actually shouldn't have it. And this idea that Diderot, you see it in his much more political writings as well. This is beautifully encapsulated in this almost allegorical kind of moment in Jacques le Fataliste, which is so interesting, particularly in context with the Rameau's nephew, but we'll go there right now. And then these ideas percolate and show up elsewhere in his other writings when he's talking about unequal power dynamics and the fact that certain people are able to profit from this. In the history of the two Indies, which is one of his final texts, I think that's the natural transition to that. He starts writing as a ghostwriter. He's not able to publish publicly, but he works with the Abbé Raynal, and he supplies text for a little bit for the 1770 edition and the 1774 edition more, and finally he's pushed to produce 20% of the 1780 edition of the first critical assessment of European colonization. It's an astonishing mishmash text. It's a different kind of encyclopedia that's trying to talk about the European influence and bad things the Europeans did in the world. And on several occasions, he will hear the kind of the echoes of what he was thinking about in Jacques. There's a moment, and I forget, I think he's talking to, it's been a while now, I think he's talking to Louis XVI at this point. It's a time of great unrest in the late 1770s. And he talks about the fact that, oh no, I'm sorry, it's Frederick II. He's writing writing about Frederick II, and he said something like, you may be the last of your race, and I might be the first of mine. And he's talking about their relative merits. It's a fascinating moment where he is talking about kind of political lineages and the fact that something is coming to an end. It's no longer the title and the thing. It's you don't deserve the title anymore either. And there are several moments like that. And what's really interesting about Diderot is he's a person who loves dialogue. Philippe Roger taught me that. It's just the fact that he takes ideas and he's not a monological thinker. He pops them up in the air and he has different people talk about ideas, but he's so interesting. And so he gets into a dialogue with Louis XVI. He gets into a dialogue with Jacques and his maître, with Rameau's nephew, between him, a kind of a version of himself, and this terrible kind of essentially homeless man who is the proponent of essentially a really interesting form of nihilism. And he's actually allows his own ideas to get interrogated in a way that very few people do. And I think this is part of his idea of thinking freely. The way for him to think freely is to do that, is to allow the ideas to actually fight themselves in air in his dialogue.
And you have very strong words at the end of chapter 12 about Diderot's contributions to Raynal's such an important book. When you write anonymous contributions to Raynal's project, not only changed the book, but history as well. That's a strong statement.
It is a strong statement.
I agree, I must say.
I feel good.
Agree completely.
I think it's really true. The Histoire des deux Indes, the history of the two Indies, the East and West Indies, was an incredibly influential book. Dozens and dozens of different editions. It went everywhere. There's even talk of the fact that perhaps Toussaint Louverture may have read parts of this. And inside this text, Diderot talks about a black Spartacus in 1780, a black Spartacus that will arise in the French colonies and will create the Code Blanc as opposed to the Code Noir. These are amazing revolutionary moments for an old man at this point. It's really interesting what's happening at this point. So, yes, and he also talks to the American insurgents. So Diderot was an Americanist for a long time, which is to say that he believed that this colony had the right to determine its own future. And there's a great moment, which I've written about and I just love in the book, where he is addressing the American insurgents. And he says that you may be afraid of England coming back and trying to take over your colony, but the biggest danger to this amazing experiment in democracy, he did say slavery is the greatest sin of North America, don't get me wrong, but the experiment that's going on in North America, we have this federalist system, it's as strong as a monarchy, but has all the elements of a democracy. The greatest fear and the greatest problem is going to be luxury and success and money. And this will create a new class of super entitled people. And he even hints in a related moment in his meditations on Seneca, that what could happen in North America would be the rise of a dictator.
It's even more interesting, by the way, that in the first edition of Raynal's book, Raynal, not Diderot, was repeating like this commonplace about the English colonies, that they were not, able to survive. They were not. I mean, the soil was not favorable to agriculture. I mean, they had not enormous resources. So there was this general thinking that there would never be a great country in America. But since we have to turn to the audience very far, I was going to throw at you two words, but one you have already reacted to, so that's be one word. The first is atheism, but you talked about that in the beginning. But there is one word I'd like to throw at you and see how you react, because I think it's so central in Diderot's thought, including his political thought: women.
Yes, very quickly, because I certainly want to get to questions here. His views on women are mixed, as is often the case during the 18th century. When he's writing a book about human physiology, he's terrified by the female womb. It's this kind of raging organ, which kind of takes over in this kind of weird organ recital and kind of is a great liability of women. At the same time, there are more kind of wonderful, smart, the innkeeper, characters to whom he gives great intelligence in his fiction, and certainly in his own private life. He's an adulterer. He has three women in his life that are not his wife. His wife was just, it was a wrong match. I'm not trying to excuse him, but what happens is that he's got three women in his life, and they're all incredibly intelligent, and they are a philosopher, and they are not kind of the typical kind of bombshells you might think would be that someone like Diderot would try to seduce. He was seduced by women's minds completely. He called Sophie Volant, who was the love of his life, and a hermaphrodite, because he was able to think with her without kind of gender roles being part of the equation. And this is kind of typical for him. I think he really And there's one more moment where he talks about women from a very sociological point of view, that the society of the time is incredibly cruel to women on about 10 different ways. So he was aware of the problems that women were facing in the 18th century. So.
I think it's for some time.
I have a question about Émilie de Châtelet. She was a very prominent scientist. She translated Newton's Principia, etc. And Voltaire, I think, was one of her tutors. And I'm just wondering, I think there's 7 years of difference between the age, between when she was born, and Diderot is about 7 years younger than she is. She died very young. So I'm just wondering, because she had such a wonderful mind and was a kind of esprit libre elle-même, I'm wondering if she had any intellectual relations, conversations with Diderot. Did he attend any of those séances she had with Voltaire and other scientists?
So the question is about the relationship between Voltaire and Diderot, and Madame du Châtelet, who was Voltaire's mistress, girlfriend, whatever you want to call it. And it's true that she dies very young, a brilliant woman who translates Newton, as you say. That Diderot and Voltaire is an interesting story because they didn't really hit it off. They kind of like, they did parallel play, as we say now with kids. And they were kind of moving along, and Diderot was an atheist and had expressed that kind of publicly, whereas Voltaire is the great Newtonian deist. And so certainly he knows about du Châtelet, but they're not really interacting. The first time he meets Voltaire is in the 1770s. So they exchange 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 letters. And certainly he is actually very interested in Newtonian ideas, but there's no real kind of direct link between them.
They are not quite in the same circle.
That's right.
Sociologically speaking. Questions?
Yeah, I'm just wondering to what extent he would have been influenced by earlier thinkers, say like Aristotle or say Machiavelli, the Prince. Would all his thoughts be original, or what for instance, who are the great thinkers that he may have studied, or just some of their ideas may have resonated with him? I'm just wondering whether
he was a great. The question is, what were the earlier influences on Diderot and Diderot's thinking? Where do we start? He is a great student of antiquity, both Roman and Greek antiquity. He is particularly fascinated, as I said, by Lucretius, and certainly the whole humanist tradition during the Renaissance. He loves Montaigne. It's a kind of a general kind of humanist education. Bacon, Locke, the whole, and the deists, the English deists as well, Shaftesbury. So there's a lot of different influences, but to get back to your atheist question, which I think is one thing I wanted to say earlier, is that during the first half of his career, he's processing a lot of these ideas in order to kind of question things like spiritual causality, miracles, and the basic, the jurisdiction of the church over science and things like that. And after he gets out of jail, and he's no longer able to kind of do this, he's interested in other things, but he's particularly interested in exploring ideas after God is no longer a hindrance. He frees himself to think about a lot of ideas that no one has thought about at that point. So that's when he becomes original, I think. It's when he thinks, what happens after God, after we get rid of God? And then his questions, his relationship to the idea of kind of materialist philosophy, ethics, art, everything is blown open when he goes beyond that. Some of his best friends are still working on atheism, putting forward atheistic texts, and he's participating, but he's much less interested in that than what happens once you accept that idea. And that's why I think he's so interesting.
Yeah, we should not forget that living without God at the time was perceived as both a problem for individual virtue. I mean, could an atheist be a moral man? And a social danger. Not having God was, taking chances in terms of social order. And it reminds me of the very cynical comment by Napoleon Bonaparte when he re-established the Catholic cult, and he was questioned by that. There were many atheists around him from the time of the revolution, and he said, We need a God in the sky for people to accept the fact that I have a fire in my chimney and they don't.
Yes, this is fascinating. Thank you for telling us about this. I wanted to ask about ethnography, Tahiti, and you mentioned the Germans, but I was curious about Johann Gottfried von Herder, because Diderot, I mean, even though they're antagonists, I was wondering what does Diderot, is Diderot aware of Herder? Are they, because in some ways they're very similar, even though they're, I don't know, they're opposed in sort of form of knowledge and so on. Is that a reasonable, I don't know if that's a reasonable question, but let me.
Let me start with ethnography first, and then Tahiti, and then kind of get to Herder, where I'll kind of try to answer that question. So yeah, Diderot, like anyone else in the 18th century, was fascinated by travel writing. And then one of the things he does is to take kind of general travel writing, and then he takes it and turns it into what I call ideological geography. Whether he's writing about Africa, whether he's writing about Tahiti, he's pushing forward ideas that have to do with democracy, that have to do with human sexuality, by looking at different kind of systems in order to kind of contrast them with European mores. It's a much more kind of sophisticated and radical version of what Montesquieu does in the Persian letters, I think. And it's hidden throughout the encyclopedia. It's really interesting to see what he says, not only about cannibalism, but about the people who supposedly practice cannibalism. And there are a lot of different interesting things he does, though. And the reference to Tahiti is very is critical, because Diderot writes a book called The Supplement to Bougainville's Voyage. And Bougainville was essentially the French captain cook who goes to Tahiti, and Diderot read Bougainville's book, and he creates this supplement to it, which is his riff on what really happens on Tahiti, which has a lot to do with human sexuality. It's almost this kind of Rousseauistic type retelling of the state of nature, and the fact that humans in Europe have made themselves miserable, absolutely miserable, by creating these complete ridiculous abstractions, religion, morality, these kind of repressive morality, and so on and so forth. It's a really, really funny book, and it's one of the best books to kind of teach of Diderot. Herder and Germany, I don't know about the kind of direct things, but certainly Diderot was very influential, particularly on the level of his theater. His theater is pretty much, at least for me, I would be hard pressed to go see a Diderot play. Might see it just to kind of say I saw it, but these are kind of really weepy. The ones that were successful, the one that was successful is a kind of a weepy, almost like a sitcom in many levels. And the era is fascinating because he's going against the Aristotelian kind of idea of theater in many levels. He's breaking free and creating something akin to a sitcom, which was radical at the time. He's talking about bourgeois, normal people, and not aristocrats or whatever. And so that is actually interesting. The Germans found this super, super important. And certainly Goethe and Schilling, Lessing know about him. So
Lessing particularly. Yeah, I think the filiation, I mean, Diderot's fortune, as we used to say in academia, Diderot's fortune in Germany is much more brilliant at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, than it is in France. In France, as Andrew told us about the French Revolution, he is not among the names that would be called for. The Nun, his novel, The Nun, because it's very anti-religious, has still a very strong echo during the French Revolution, because it attacks the convents. So it's not exactly the question of atheism which is posed there. But the theater was the vehicle through which Diderot's thought were completely adopted. I mean, Goethe was one of the first readers of Rameau's Nephew. Lessing, dramatic theory is entirely inspired by Diderot's not only plays, but also, of course, his text about theater, which are, in fact, much more fun to read than the plays themselves. It happens. Yes.
You mentioned,
Pardon.
sorry,
You mentioned earlier, previous answer, kind of his thoughts on the purpose of God, or my words, life after God. I'm curious about influence on Nietzsche, and how their ideas compare.
Want to take this one?
Yeah. If you want to take it, I'm ready to take it, because there is a very interesting book relating directly to your question on the 18th century French influences on Nietzsche by someone called Guillaume Métayer, a very bright young scholar. He wrote his dissertation on that at the Sorbonne, and it shows in a very convincing way that paradoxically, the reference in the French 18th century for Nietzsche was not Diderot, was not Rousseau, of course he hated Rousseau, but was Voltaire, and that Nietzsche had an enormous admiration for the entirety of Voltaire's oeuvre. So I have been very convinced by this exploration, like this old-fashioned dissertation, like 1,000 pages, you know? And it's clear that Diderot was not a major, although Nietzsche appreciated some aspects of Diderot's thought, specifically moments when Diderot is closer to the so-called moralistic tradition, aphorism, thoughts about, but it's not a major influence on Nietzsche.
Yeah, I come at this as a complete novice, but I'm curious about, is there a tension in someone so obsessed with posterity working on an encyclopedia, which at least to my mind is a project that is never done and when one begins to undertake, will be continued on for future generations? Or is that understanding of an encyclopedia not in fact at play here? And then maybe as a smaller tagline, in what way is an encyclopedia a democratic project? It sounds intuitively right to me, but I'd like to learn more about that.
Yeah. So the question is, how, to what extent is encyclopediaism a democratic project?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the big question that you're asking. And I think from Diderot's perspective, it really was. For the longest time, dictionary makers would be 2 or 3 people. And so all the world's knowledge would come down and be filtered through kind of an individual perspective. And that's very different from the way, at least he envisioned the encyclopedia, which would be the society of people of letters, gens de lettres, a huge kind of democratic thing where you have de Bontemps, the greatest naturalist, writing articles, and Rousseau writing, articles on music. And he did have 150 people collaborating on this at one time when things were kind of cooking well. But, and this is a much more kind of democratic view of knowledge. A second thing is that the hierarchy of knowledge was broken down by alphabetical order. Alphabetical order was a kind of a radical idea in this particular context, because it allowed for the hierarchies of knowledge to be thrown over. So you could have an article on falconry, an aristocratic type thing, next to something that was, how to make pottery or something. And so that was an interesting thing, in that it brought up the trades, which were seen kind of as like a Jacques, it was like the work of Jacques. And so, and the encyclopedia itself has 11 volumes of plates, which is a huge inventory of all the work being done in France, the important work, as opposed to falconry or heraldry. I think Jimmy Swales I did an interview with him at one point, who's the kind of the guy who invented Wikipedia, who said that Diderot is the patron saint of Wikipedia, because Diderot exemplified the idea that knowledge is for a large public. He wanted to change the way people thought. He wanted to introduce ideas that were being tamped down by the church. So that, I think it's in this particular encyclopedia.
Yeah, I think that's 3 major reasons. And the alphabetic order, I'm taking your second reason. I think the third one is very important. Also, the encyclopedia speaks about technical things, about, how to make cheese. I have that's not an original. I have an engraving in my country house with how to make cheese in the Alps. With all the instruments and the know-how. And the alphabetic order, just a word on that, the alphabetic order was being denounced at the time. Of course, Voltaire was using it massively as a weapon of mass destruction. But the alphabetic order has been denounced constantly in religious tracts and pamphlets against the encyclopedists. The sheer fact that a book was in alphabetic order was the sign that they were trying to destroy religion and society. Chaudon is one of the guys that polemics. Laurent first and then, okay.
Thank you so much. I'm curious if Diderot has a dark side for you. I mean, the entries in the encyclopedia that I know the best are ideological, they're partisan, they're fiery, they're as much spreading artisanal knowledge as fake news, we might say. The revolution that he might have hoped for, although he died too young, is always ever incomplete. The old regime persists. I guess I'm curious if where this side of him comes through for you.
Well, the question is, does Diderot have a dark side?
Yeah.
And do we see it in the encyclopedia? I think that in the encyclopedia, and it's so hard because he does this over 25 years. I suspect if we looked at all of our lives, there are moments where you would say like, oh, you've got a dark side this year, but next year you don't. He went through some really tough times. And so there were times where he was profoundly unhappy. You just can't imagine the persecution this guy went through for decades. And I don't think it's a coincidence. This guy had a terrible stomach. He had a terrible stomach. He was constantly, I think he had a hiatal hernia, actually. I diagnosed it because I had that too. And it really hurt. It really hurt him. He was suffering quite a bit. But I think if he had a dark side, it would not be necessarily, he had a funny side. And sometimes he had a dark sense of humor in the encyclopedia where he says that, cannibalism entry goes to hotel. How to say that in English? Altar. It goes to altar. It goes to a kind of religious kind of idea because hostie, host, communion, right? So there's this kind of interesting side to him that's a kind of dark sense of humor. I think the dark side of Diderot might be linked to his relationship, for example, to Rousseau. And that's where you see a moment where neither he nor Rousseau, who is pretty much borderline personality disorder type person, neither he nor Rousseau really acted well, I think, at that point. There was a really vindictive side of Diderot, which doesn't make sense. Diderot would often say that he who is not happy is a fool, and he made himself miserable. So he was being a fool at that point. So I think that's the one kind of moment that is not kind of a moment of shining glory for me. So if I had to kind of pick one thing.
I wanted to ask you a bit more about the anti-slavery of Diderot, which always strikes me. Actually, the image for this series is, it's not Toussaint Louverture, but it's Dessalines and Pétion. It's a French painting kind of made in honor of the founding of Haiti. But I'm always so struck by the Raynal passage. And I know that he's drawing on Mercier and other kinds of sources, but there's something so intense about that. It's not just that he calls for a Black Spartacus, he basically celebrates the potential overthrow, the violent overthrow of slavery as a redemption for kind of the human race, really, right? The kind of, and I'm always kind of curious to know, I really agree with you. I think there's probably maybe even a stronger case for his influence on the Haitian Revolution than the French Revolution discussed, but that I think that there really is, it's a very important text for what unfolds during the revolution in the Caribbean. But also I'm kind of curious about the sources for it. Like how does it just seems, I guess in some ways it seems to me like it comes a little bit out of nowhere. Like what are the other people who are imagining something like that? And as we discussed yesterday, he mentions that the Quakers will probably be, saved because they've abolished slavery. So it's an abolitionist, but it's just very different from any of the other thinkers I can think of writing about slavery, like Condorcet or others. And I just wondered, is that from conversations he's in? I kind of think about what the sources for Diderot's thought are. And I was just curious, you almost see that a little bit more in theater. Yeah. So you do see it in like Voltaire's Asile or others, or theaters that kind of celebrate violence, and really anti-colonial violence. But it really is striking. And I wondered, if you could delve more into it.
Yeah, so Diderot's anti-colonial thought is something that's really fascinating. It's complex because it was only discovered when they looked at a manuscript of the history of the two Indies and saw that he had, added, they've actually found the edition of the Histoire des Deux Ans that had the annotations marked down, what he added. So we really just figured this out quite recently. And I think what's really amazing about it is this idea of this Black Spartacus. And there are tendencies, they're kind of precursors to this. You talked about Mercier, and this is the year 2440, which is science fiction. But that's in the future. The idea that there would be the adventure of the new world, that's in the future. Diderot is talking about the present. I think that's really very interesting. And there's a call to arms on a certain level. And so rhetorically, he does go farther than other people. But what I really think is amazing about Diderot, and this goes back to some of my work on the history of race, is that he was the first person really to actively refute some of the real racist ideas. And I use that word very carefully. The racist ideas that are circulating in the 1770s. The whole anti-slavery movement for 20 years has really had nothing to do with, people will say that Africans are inferior, but we shouldn't enslave them. And Diderot is one of the first kind of counter-discursive thinkers, maybe the first counter-discursive thinker to take the arguments, the physiological arguments about the supposed inferiority of Africans and refute them line by line. Because he understands that you can't, and this is happening, you cannot have an effective anti-slavery discourse without getting rid of that. I think that's actually more radical in some ways. There's a whole tendency of what happens during the 18th century is the idea of race migrates from the exterior of the body to the interior of the body. As anatomists and others start looking not only at skin color, but they start saying there's black brains, black blood, black bile, black sperm, and that the idea of race is on the inside. It's absolutely insane. And these ideas are circulating, and Diderot understands this. It's actually interesting because this is cutting edge science. And Diderot, who's always into cutting edge science, goes back and says, this is not true.
And it's a good opportunity to remind all of you that this is Act 1 of 2 acts, and the second act at 3 p.m. in New Cabell Hall, French department, will be about those topics, with Andrew, of course, talking to us about the race makers in the Enlightenment. So
It's in New Cabell Hall, what room? Just
303.
303, okay, yeah.
New Cabell Hall, 3rd floor, 303.
So if you,
3 p.m. Be there.
yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all. Pick up a book if you'd like, and Andrew will be able to sign.